Please subscribe and share or more story. It was the Monday before Thanksgiving when Margaret Lawson, 66 years old, realized she was no longer welcome in her son's life. She stood on the narrow stone steps of his townhouse, holding a freshly baked pecan pie, the warmth of it seeping through the cardboard box into her palms. The smell reminded her of earlier years, loud kitchens, laughter, flour on countertops. "We talked about this, Mom," her son Daniel Lawson said, stepping outside and pulling the door nearly shut behind him. He did not hug her. He did not smile. "Talked about what?" Margaret asked gently. "You can't stay here this week," he replied, avoiding her eyes. "You'll need to get a hotel." The words landed without ceremony. No apology. No hesitation. Margaret blinked once. "I brought the pie you like," she said quietly. "And a gift for Noah." Daniel exhaled through his nose, as if she were complicating something already decided. "It's just not going to work." Behind him, the autumn wreath on the door swayed slightly in the cold wind. It looked festive, inviting, lying. Margaret had imagined this moment differently. In her mind, her grandson Noah, 9 years old, would fling the door open and wrap his arms around her waist. She had spent weeks restoring his gift, a brass compass from an old maritime shop, polished by hand, the glass replaced, the needle steady again. She had wrapped it carefully and tucked it into a navy gift bag she now held in her left hand. "My bags are still in the car," she said, trying again. "Just like last year. I'll be out of your way." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Mom." Before he could finish, his wife Clara appeared behind him. Her posture was perfect. Her smile was not. Her eyes moved quickly from the pie to the gift bag to Margaret's face, measuring, dismissing. "Honestly, Margaret," Clara said smoothly, "with the house so chaotic, it's better this way. You'd be more comfortable somewhere with proper service." Margaret said nothing. She knew that tone. It was the sound people used when they wanted to feel reasonable while being cruel. "At your age," Clara continued, tilting her head slightly, "you need consistency. Good heating. A firm mattress. We just don't have the space." Margaret felt her throat tighten, but she kept her voice steady. "I don't take up much room." Clara smiled thinly. "You do, actually. Emotionally." Daniel shifted, but said nothing. His silence felt heavier than Clara's words. "I thought family made room," Margaret said softly. "That's not fair," Daniel muttered. Clara reached for the door handle. "We're trying to keep things simple this year." The door closed, not slammed, not rushed, just a quiet, expensive click. The kind that said the decision had been finalized long before she arrived. Margaret stood there as the pie cooled in her hands. Across the street, a neighbor untangled a box of holiday lights, humming faintly. Somewhere nearby, music drifted through a window. Inside the house behind the door, laughter began. Margaret understood then. She had already been written out of the scene. She did not knock again. She stepped down slowly, letting the sharp November wind cut through her coat. The back seat of her car held things meant for that house, a knitted throw for their couch, tins of lemon biscuits for Clara's parents. She stared at them for a moment, then drove past the block without turning back. Margaret had not come unprepared. 3 months earlier, she had quietly sold the coastal cottage in Cape Arlen, the home she and her late husband Thomas had spent nearly 25 years restoring. It sold for $3.2 million. No announcements. No celebration. She told no one. She wanted to know what love looked like without money attached to it. So she asked to stay. So she waited. Now she had her answer. She pulled over, breathing evenly, and made a call she did not need to look up. "The Whitmore Hotel," the receptionist answered. "Yes," Margaret said calmly. "I'd like to reserve your executive suite starting tonight." There was a pause. Then, "Of course, Ms. Lawson." By 8:12 p.m., Margaret walked through the marble lobby of the Whitmore, her name displayed neatly on the welcome board. The air smelled of polished wood and citrus. Someone smiled at her, not out of obligation, but recognition. The suite was quiet, overlooking the city lights. She placed the gift bag on the desk and sat without turning on the lamps. For a long moment, she simply listened to her own breathing. Her phone vibrated. Fraud alert. Unusual activity detected. She opened it slowly. Charges scrolled down the screen. Luxury clothing, resort deposit, electronics. All recent. All linked to the card she had given Daniel for emergencies. Margaret closed her eyes once. So this is how, she whispered. This was not about Thanksgiving. This had been building for a long time. She reached into her purse and removed a thick envelope she had carried for weeks. Inside were documents she had refused to sign, recordings she had never mentioned, and proof she had hoped she would never need. Margaret Lawson was done waiting to be spared. Now she would be heard. Margaret did not sleep that night. She sat by the window with a cup of untouched tea, watching the city pulse beneath her like a living thing that had never needed permission to breathe. Somewhere below, car horns sounded, laughter spilled from a late-night bar, and life moved forward without consulting her pain. That realization steadied her. At dawn, she opened her laptop and reviewed documents she had once hoped would remain buried forever. Years earlier, Daniel had asked her to sign what he called a routine update to her estate plan. "Just housekeeping, Mom," he'd said. "You trust me, right?" She had trusted him enough to read carefully. What she found instead was a disguised power of attorney, broad, invasive, and dangerously final. One signature would have given him full control over her finances while she was still alive. Margaret hadn't signed. Her attorney confirmed it had been intentional deception. Sitting in the quiet glow of the morning, Margaret whispered, "You planned this." And that truth changed everything. Later that morning, her phone rang. Daniel's name flashed on the screen. "Mom," he said quickly when she answered. "Clara didn't mean what she said. Things just got hectic." Margaret leaned back in her chair. "Hectic enough to lock me out?" Silence. Noah was overwhelmed. Daniel tried. "And the guest room." "Daniel," she interrupted calmly, "when did you start using my money?" He inhaled sharply. "What?" "The card," she said. "The purchases. The travel deposit. Was that an emergency?" Another pause. Longer this time. "I was going to tell you," he said. Margaret closed her eyes. She had heard that sentence before. "You didn't," she replied. By the time the call ended, she understood something essential. The door hadn't been closed impulsively. It had been locked carefully, after they believed there was nothing left inside worth stealing. Margaret spent the afternoon making calls. Not angry ones. Precise ones. Her banker. Her attorney. An old colleague from the nonprofit board she once chaired. Each conversation followed the same pattern. Polite surprise, then quiet respect. "You were always careful," her banker said. "I assumed you had reasons." "I did," Margaret replied. By evening, her accounts were frozen, her access secured, her name removed from anything Daniel could touch. The speed was almost comforting. Systems worked when truth was finally applied to them. That night, room service arrived unprompted. A tray of soup, bread, and a handwritten note welcoming her. She ate slowly, aware that dignity often returned in small, unexpected gestures. She no longer felt abandoned. She felt underestimated. And that, Margaret knew, was a mistake people only made once. The next morning, Margaret walked into the hotel's event office and asked to speak with the director. "I'd like to sponsor a public gathering," she said. The director raised an eyebrow. "What kind?" "One that celebrates aging with dignity," Margaret replied, "and reminds families who built the foundation they stand on." Within minutes, dates were discussed. Venues sketched. Budgets outlined. "I'll remain anonymous," Margaret added. "Of course. And I want open invitations," she continued. "Teachers, nurses, retirees, anyone who's ever been told they were no longer useful." The director paused, then nodded. Margaret left with her spine straight and her steps lighter. For the first time in years, she was not reacting. She was choosing. Emails from Daniel and Clara began arriving that evening. "We should talk. This has gotten out of hand. Noah misses you." Margaret read them without responding. She had learned the difference between concern and consequence. Instead, she reviewed another file, audio recordings from a family tablet Daniel had borrowed months earlier. Conversations he hadn't known were saved. "She won't last forever," his voice said in one clip. Another followed. "Once the house is settled, it'll all be cleaner." Margaret did not cry. She labeled the folder simply, "Truth." The gala took shape quickly. Flyers were sent. Invitations accepted. The city responded with enthusiasm she hadn't anticipated. On the night before the event, Margaret stood alone in the ballroom, watching staff arrange chairs beneath soft lights. She imagined Daniel there, Clara beside him, smiling, unaware. This was not revenge. It was correction, and it would be public. That night, Margaret slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. Tomorrow, the silence would end. And when it did, it would speak in her voice. Margaret woke before sunrise, the room still wrapped in silence. For a long moment, she lay there listening to the steady rhythm of her own breathing. There was no dread in it anymore, only focus. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple navy coat and pearl earrings Thomas had once given her after a lecture she thought had gone poorly. "You always underestimate yourself," he'd said that night. Downstairs, the city was already stirring. She watched commuters hurry past the hotel windows, each person certain of where they were going. That certainty settled into her bones. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Daniel. "Please, Mom. Let's talk. This has gone too far." Margaret smiled faintly. Too far was what people said when consequences finally reached them. She didn't reply. Instead, she reviewed the final event schedule on her tablet. Every detail was in place. The timing, the speakers, the closing segment. She wasn't nervous. She was ready. By mid-morning, confirmation emails poured in. Community leaders, retired educators, hospital staff, senior advocacy groups. The guest list grew broader and more powerful than Daniel would ever expect. Margaret met briefly with the audiovisual coordinator, a young man with sharp eyes and careful manners. "I have 2 files," she told him. "They must play in this order." He glanced at the file names, then looked back up. "Understood." "Sound on," Margaret added. "No edits." He nodded once. As she left the control room, her phone rang again. Clara this time. "We never said you weren't welcome forever," Clara said tightly. "You're being dramatic." Margaret stopped walking. "You shut the door in my face," she replied calmly. "What part of that was temporary?" Clara didn't answer. Margaret ended the call. That afternoon, Margaret made one final visit to the bank. The paperwork took less than an hour. When she stood to leave, the manager shook her hand. "You've protected yourself well," he said. "I had good teachers," Margaret replied. Back in her suite, she found the gift bag still sitting untouched on the desk. The brass compass inside caught the light. She traced its edge gently, then placed it back. Some gifts needed the right moment. Outside, clouds rolled in, heavy and low. The weather matched her thoughts. This night would change everything. Not just for her, but for Daniel, for Clara, for the illusion they had carefully curated. She felt no thrill at the thought, only inevitability. As evening approached, Margaret stood before the mirror and studied her reflection. She did not look like a woman seeking revenge. She looked like someone reclaiming authorship of her own life. Her phone buzzed one last time. A text from Daniel. "We're at the hotel. We'd like to see you." Margaret typed back 3 words. "Enjoy the evening." Downstairs, the ballroom lights warmed, music drifted softly through the corridors, and guests began to arrive, unaware they were about to witness a truth long buried. Margaret picked up her coat and headed for the elevator. Tonight, the story would no longer be told about her. It would be told by her. Margaret did not enter the ballroom right away. She stood on the upper-level balcony, partially hidden by a marble column, watching the crowd below as if observing a carefully staged play. Crystal chandeliers glowed overhead. White linens covered the tables. Laughter floated upward in polite waves. She saw Daniel first. He stood tall, confident in a tailored suit, scanning the room as if expecting to be recognized. Clara followed closely beside him, her smile fixed, her hand resting possessively on his arm. They looked comfortable, entitled. Margaret noticed where they were seated, not near the front, but not in the back either. Close enough to feel important, far enough to be overlooked. It was perfect. Noah trailed behind them, his small shoulders hunched, his eyes searching the room. When he looked up, he paused, almost as if he sensed her presence. Margaret stepped back into the shadow before he could see her. This was not the moment. She waited. The program began with gentle speeches. A retired nurse spoke about the quiet dignity of growing older. A former teacher described the pain of being treated like an inconvenience by his own children. The room grew still as story after story found its mark. Margaret watched Daniel shift in his seat. Clara crossed and uncrossed her legs. Their comfort was fading. Then the lights dimmed further. The host returned to the podium. Tonight, we hear from the anonymous benefactor who made this gathering possible. The screen lit up with images, elderly hands holding photographs, grandparents laughing with grandchildren, faces lined with years and meaning. Soft music played. The audience was fully captured. Margaret leaned forward slightly. The first file ended. The screen went black. Then Daniel's voice filled the room. "She won't need it much longer," his voice said clearly. "We just have to be patient." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. Heads turned. A glass clinked sharply against the floor. The recording continued, his words unfiltered, unmistakable. Plans. Assumptions. Entitlement laid bare. Clara froze. Daniel's face drained of color. The screen changed again. A still image appeared, Margaret standing alone on their doorstep, holding a pie. The door closed behind her. Text followed, simple and devastating. "My mother is a burden." Silence swallowed the room. Then the lights began to rise. Margaret stepped forward from the balcony, calm and visible now, no longer hidden. For the first time that evening, Daniel looked up and truly saw her. Whispers rushed through the ballroom like a sudden wind. Chairs scraped softly against the floor as people turned, searching for the source of the voice they had just heard. Daniel remained frozen, his mouth slightly open, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only solid thing left in the room. Clara leaned toward him, whispering urgently, but her words were lost in the growing murmur. Margaret walked down the stairs slowly, one hand resting on the polished railing. Each step was measured. She was not walking toward confrontation. She was walking toward ownership. When she reached the floor, conversations faltered. People recognized her then, the woman from the screen, the mother from the recording. Faces softened. Some nodded. Others looked away, ashamed by proxy. Margaret stopped near the center aisle. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "Thank you for listening," she said calmly. The room fell silent. Daniel finally stood. "This is private," he said hoarsely. "This shouldn't be happening like this." Margaret turned to face him. "It happened the moment you decided I was something to be managed instead of someone to be loved." Clara rose beside him, her smile gone. "You're humiliating us," she said sharply. Margaret met her gaze. "No," she replied. "I'm telling the truth. Humiliation comes from being seen clearly after pretending for too long." The host hovered nearby, uncertain, but Margaret raised a hand gently. "This gathering was never about shame," she said, addressing the room. "It was about visibility." She gestured toward the screen. "And about what happens when we decide certain lives are expendable." No one interrupted her. Daniel swallowed hard. "You're destroying this family." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "Families are destroyed when trust is treated like currency." She reached into her handbag and placed a sealed envelope on the table between them. "Those are copies," she said. "Everything has already been finalized." Daniel opened it with trembling hands. His eyes scanned the pages. Clara leaned in, her breath catching. "What is this?" Daniel whispered. "My will," Margaret said simply. "And the charter for the Lawson Foundation." She turned back to the guests. All assets formerly under my name have been transferred into a trust dedicated to protecting elderly individuals from financial abuse and abandonment. A low murmur swept through the room again, this time not of shock, but respect. Daniel looked up, his voice barely audible. "You cut us off. You were never entitled to it," Margaret replied gently. "You were entrusted with love, not ownership." Clara shook her head in disbelief. "You planned this." Margaret nodded once. "I prepared for it." She glanced toward Noah, who stood a few steps away, eyes wide and frightened. Margaret softened. "This is not about punishment," she said quietly. "It's about correction. And about teaching the next generation that dignity is not conditional." She stepped back from the table and turned toward the exit as applause slowly began to build, hesitant at first, then steady and strong. Margaret did not look back. Margaret exited the ballroom through a side corridor as applause continued behind her, the sound muffled but unmistakable. She did not pause to absorb it. Validation had never been her goal. Outside, the night air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of traffic and the promise of rain. Inside the hotel lobby, she waited calmly near the elevators. It did not take long. Daniel appeared, breathless, his tie loosened, his confidence gone. Clara followed a few steps behind, speaking urgently into her phone before snapping it shut. "You didn't have to do that," Daniel said, his voice shaking. Margaret looked at him steadily. "I did." "You exposed us," Clara snapped. Margaret's gaze shifted to her. "You exposed yourselves." "I only removed the curtain." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "You turned everyone against us." "No," Margaret replied. "I gave everyone the information you assumed I'd die with." Silence fell between them, thick and unavoidable. They moved into a quiet seating area. Daniel sat heavily, his shoulders slumped. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said. Margaret sat across from him. "That's what people say when they confuse intention with impact." Clara crossed her arms. "So, what now?" Margaret folded her hands in her lap. "Now you live with the truth." Daniel looked up, eyes rimmed red. "You've cut us off completely." "I protected myself," she corrected, "from exploitation disguised as care." He swallowed. "You think this makes you strong?" Margaret answered without hesitation. "No. It means I stopped pretending I was weak." Clara opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. There was nothing left to bargain with. The next morning, sunlight filled Margaret's suite. She stood by the window as her attorney confirmed the final filings. "The Lawson Foundation is active," he said. "First grants will be issued within the month." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. "Good." A knock came at the door. Daniel stood there alone, holding a folder. "We signed everything," he said quietly. "No access. No claims." Margaret took the folder and nodded. "Evan cried last night," Daniel added. "Not because he was scared. Because he understood." She met his gaze. "And you?" He hesitated. "I confused ambition with entitlement. And love with leverage." Margaret stepped aside, allowing him to leave with his dignity intact, what little remained. Later that day, Daniel stood before cameras meant for damage control and told the truth instead. He spoke plainly. No excuses. No deflection. He named his failures and acknowledged the woman he had tried to erase. There was no applause. Only silence. Margaret watched none of it. She checked out quietly, declined interviews, and left the city behind her. Justice, she knew, did not require an audience. It required action. Margaret drove north as the road opened ahead of her, the past receding mile by mile. She was no longer just a mother waiting to be welcomed. She was a founder, a protector, a woman who had refused to disappear quietly. They had told her to find a hotel. Instead, she built a shelter for truth, for dignity, for those made invisible by the very people who owed them care. The future stretched wide and unclaimed. And for the first time in years, it belonged entirely to her. Thanks for watching. If you value stories of respect, dignity, and justice, please subscribe. It means more than you know, and it lets me keep sharing the lessons life has carved into me.